Lots of people have lots of devices to track how many steps they take each day. I try to imagine how many steps the first 12 disciples would have taken across Israel during their time with Jesus. They were constantly on the move. Well, almost constantly. We pick up the story today with Jesus and the 12 disciples stopped at the side of a road, not far from Jerusalem. Jesus gave specific instructions to two of them. He said, "Go into the village over there, and you will see a donkey tied there with a colt beside it. Untie them and bring them here. If anyone asks you what you're doing, just say the Lord needs them, and he will immediately send them." After 3 years with Jesus, there likely wasn't much that caught the disciples by surprise. This might have. They would have logged hundreds, if not thousands of miles all across what we call the Holy Land. But until that point, the Bible doesn't mention them or him ever riding anything. Then came this command: go get two donkeys. The two disciples found them just as Jesus had said they would be. Although it must have been at least a little suspicious when they began to untie them. It was just before the massive annual Passover celebration. So Jerusalem and the towns around it would have been jammed full of people. The crowds would have been like elbow to elbow, like after a game at a packed sports stadium, if you remember those. The people who lived there would have been keeping a close eye on their homes and their stuff. Well, then along came these two men, and they started untying, helping themselves to two donkeys. And as they are in many places today, donkeys were very valuable back then. In Luke's account, the owners asked what the disciples were doing, although the language may have been stronger than that. The answer: the Lord needs it. There isn't even a hint of resistance in any of the gospel accounts by the owner. So was it prearranged? Had Jesus set it up last time he was in the area? Had he sent a messenger to tell them? We don't know. Apparently, neither did the two disciples. And when nobody challenged them, they headed back to where Jesus was. Now, we don't know what happened to the older donkey, but when they got to Jesus, they took their coats off and put them on the colt, kind of like a riding blanket. Jesus got on, and they were off to Jerusalem. Jesus knew what he was going to face there. And as we've seen over the past few weeks, he was extremely emotional. And seeing him that way shook their thoughts and their emotions. And that would have intensified as they heard growing opposition to Jesus, including insults from his own family and threats from the religious leaders. The disciples wondered aloud about the wisdom of going to Jerusalem. And it must have really rattled them when he got on that donkey and kept moving toward the city, especially since time after time over the previous 3 years, they had seen him trying to stay out of the spotlight, often telling people to not tell anyone about miracles he'd done. And riding a donkey, rather than walking into Jerusalem, would have been a bold, puzzling, and even a volatile public statement. After a battle, a conquering king or general would ride a stallion into the defeated city. A king would ride a donkey as a symbol, a demonstration that there was peace in the land. Riding into Jerusalem would have been seen as a statement, first of all, that he was a king, and that would have angered both the Roman and the Jewish leaders, and it would have confused most Israelites. They had increasingly begun to hope and even believe Jesus was the long-awaited chosen one who would lead an uprising against Rome. So again, heading into the city that way would have been triggering all kinds of thoughts and emotions for all kinds of people. And there would have been all kinds of people in and around Jerusalem that year. Some scholars say the city of 50,000 or so swelled to 3 million people for that Passover. While Rome would have sent extra soldiers to keep the peace, the vast majority were Jews. And during Passover, they would have been bursting with excitement about their history and their ancestry. Riding a donkey said what words never could have. Most people in a massive, excited crowd normally won't stop to listen. And even if they did, there was no way Jesus could have spoken in a way that more than a handful closest to him could have heard. So he did something huge, many could see. And it would have spread like a dry brush fire through the crowds. It's that guy Jesus, and he's riding a donkey. Riding a donkey was a dramatic fulfillment of the words of Zechariah. Both Matthew and John quoted the 600-year-old prediction God had given the old prophet. Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey, a colt. Centuries later, John reported his disciples didn't understand at the time that this was a fulfillment of prophecy. But after Jesus entered into his glory, they remembered. That is fascinating, especially because all the religious leaders and most Jews would have known that passage. But at that point in history, most were looking more for like a bold, buffed warrior who would lead them against the Romans. Jesus was not making a claim for a kingdom the way most Jews would have expected nor wanted. He didn't ride a white stallion dressed in the fanciest clothes, surrounded by a mighty army. He wobbled into Jerusalem, wearing his regular clothes on the back of a donkey colt. And his army was an unorganized mob of fishermen and farmers and shepherds and women. That would have been profoundly disappointing, that year in particular. There was more than normal on the minds of the people as they arrived for Passover. This Jesus was on the lips and in the minds of many. And word of his miracles had spread like a brush fire, feeding thousands from a few Hebrew Lunchables, healing leprosy, restoring sight, cripples walking. Most recently, Lazarus coming back from the dead. And not only that, Jesus had stood up to the Jewish leaders in a way no one else dared to, even though most Jews were quietly disappointed with the way their leaders kept bowing to the Romans. The bottom line is, word spread far and wide about Jesus heading to Jerusalem for Passover, the massive annual Jewish freedom celebration. Thousands would have been looking intensely for Jesus in Jerusalem. Thousands more would have packed the road as word got around that he was coming, and they would have just jammed all around that road. The numbers would have grown with each step as word kept spreading. And many then began to flock from Jerusalem out to where he was, and many more streamed toward him from the surrounding villages, including the one where Lazarus lived, died, and was living again. And John reported when all the people heard of Jesus' arrival, they flocked to see him and also to see Lazarus. They flocked to see him. Thousands began taking off their coats and laying them down on the road in front of him. We need to be really careful to not be influenced by art we've seen or even Sunday school coloring pages. Remember, there were millions of people packed into Jerusalem. And many of them climbed palm trees, and they cut off the branches for the colt to walk on, and others waved the palm branches. And that had to have been one of the most amazing things John had ever seen. That is, until near the end of his life, when he was given an unprecedented look into heaven. And he wrote, I saw a vast crowd, too great to count, from every nation and tribe and people and language, standing in front of the throne and before the Lamb. They were clothed in white robes and held palm branches in their hands. Palm branches were an emblem of victory and restoration. That day in Jerusalem, the people of Israel were convinced victory was so close they could taste it. On the one hand, they were right. On the other hand, most of them were very wrong about what the battle was really against and how victory was going to happen. Jesus did not enter Jerusalem with a club swinging and arrows flying. He didn't storm in, but his entrance was unavoidable. Matthew wrote, the whole city was stirred. And the word for stirred meant shaking and trembling and rocking. Now, some of that would have come from laughter. There was no shortage of mockery and wisecracks. Some, including some of his own family, saw Jesus as a lunatic. After all, it was a ridiculous picture. A homeless, unemployed carpenter declaring himself king. Other people were downright angry. More than that, they would have seen his colt ride into the city as at least arrogance, if not blasphemy against God. Many met him with joy, welcoming him as the one who had come to reestablish the throne of David by breaking Rome's grip on their corner of the empire. They were ready and eager to place a crown on Jesus' head. Among the crowds would have been people he had healed. Some would have been from among the thousands he had fed. Many would have seen his miracles and had listened with amazement at his teaching. Many had seen their lives transformed. I wonder if Bartimaeus was there, the blind man who had received his sight. What about Zacchaeus, the wee little man who had paid back a huge debt to society and had made his peace with God? And the lepers, actually former lepers, their rotted flesh miraculously and completely healed. Maybe Jairus' daughter was there, back to life after experiencing death. Lazarus and Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene and his own mother would have been as close to him as they could get. And I wonder how the disciples were reacting to all of it. Judas was likely pleased. It later became clear he only wanted an earthly kingdom, so this kind of celebration was like right up his alley. Could you see Peter walking with his chest puffed out a little farther than normal, enjoying the cheers of the crowd, maybe with a hand on his sword just in case something went wrong? And what about Thomas, the one who came to be labeled the doubter? I wonder if he was wondering if they were all going to get trampled or if they would all wind up in jail. Andrew was likely overwhelmed. He was more used to bringing people to Jesus one by one, and now thousands were rushing at them. And in that wide array of opinions and emotions, the donkey rumbled toward the city, and things were rocking. And as Jesus rode, the crowd grew, and so did the party atmosphere. It was Passover, and people gathered from far and wide for the greatest of all Jewish holidays. Then, with crowds pressing in from every side, the whole procession stopped. Luke reported, as he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city ahead, he began to weep. So picture rush hour on one of the busy streets near you. One car stops and all others have to stop. Imagine the people way back in the crowd straining to see what was going on, asking, "Hey, what's the holdup? What's going on?" The people closest to Jesus would have realized he was the one who stopped the parade. Then they would have seen his body begin to shake. At first, they may have thought he was laughing. That would have made sense. It was a joy filled procession. But then someone saw his face and saw the tears. And they knew it was that kind of weeping that goes on at funerals where your whole body is engaged. And it says, when the city came into view, he wept over it. If you had only recognized this day and everything that was good for you. But now it's too late. Oh, they had eyes, but they didn't see. They had ears, but they didn't hear. They missed the whole point of the message God was giving to them. By waving palm branches, they were showing they expected Jesus to be some kind of paramilitary leader who would lead them to overthrow the Romans. They were saying they were ready to pick up their swords and shields and go to war if he would lead them. But Jesus knew he didn't come for that. You get an incredible panorama of Jerusalem when you come over the top of the Mount of Olives and start making your way down toward the city. As Jesus looked down on the city, he was overcome with emotion. The word translated wept meant more than just a couple of tears. It was a deeply passionate, gut-wrenching word, so his whole body was heaving and shaking. Do you see this picture? Do you see the contrast? The crowd singing and shouting and praising Jesus. And Jesus with his head down and tears streaming, and his body shaking with grief. 2 verses later, in Luke 19, we see part of what was behind the tears. He said, "In the days ahead, your enemies are going to bring up their heavy artillery and surround you, pressing in from every side. They'll smash you and your babies on the pavement. Not one stone will be left intact. All this because you did not recognize and welcome God's personal visits." Because of the paths the people had chosen, morally, politically, even spiritually, Jesus knew horrible times were coming. He had seen it all spiraling downward for centuries. As part of the Trinity, he knew how indescribably patient the Father is. But Jesus also would have known the limit of that. And Jesus saw ahead to 70 AD when the Romans attacked and destroyed Jerusalem. He wept knowing the unthinkable pain that would be inflicted on everyone in the city, from newborns to the very old. And the greatest tragedy was, if they had abandoned their dreams of political power, it could have been avoided. Let me say that again. If they had abandoned their dreams of political power, it could have been avoided. That makes me as nervous as anything today in this country. And by the way, anyone who wants to try to imitate the righteous anger Jesus showed in the temple later in the week needs to keep what Jesus modeled here in mind. Centuries of anguish led to what he did in the temple. Jerusalem would not be easy pickings. It was a very well protected city. It would have had to have been surrounded by a massive force and cut off from everything and everyone, and that's what the Romans did. It was a slow, strong, and violent squeeze. As Jesus went down to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, he could see into the future, and he could see bodies in the streets and blood in the gutters and tens of thousands of people starving to death while the Romans waited for the surviving Jews to surrender and for their opportunity to pretty much just walk into the city and level it. All because God's children didn't recognize the Messiah when he came. Oh, he could have snapped his fingers to get the Holy Spirit to open their eyes, but that wasn't part of God's eternal design. And Jesus restarted his donkey ride into the city to fulfill what was in God's design. Luke reported Pharisees were in the crowd as Jesus wobbled along, and somewhere along the route they could no longer stand the crowds calling Jesus the King and the Son of David, and each Hosanna would have churned their stomachs. And finally they shouted at Jesus, "Rebuke your people." And Jesus told them that even he did quiet them down, the rocks on the side of the road would have cried out. Wouldn't it have been cool if that had happened? But Jesus had a whole other emotion going here. He had special tears for the men who were so close to the Father's house, but so far away from the Father. As God had said through Isaiah, "Oh, those people say they're mine. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands from God." Ooh, catch that last part. They teach man-made ideas as commands from God. And Jesus still weeps for people like them. Modern versions of ancient Jewish legalists. Now, there was another group on the sidelines of the donkey ride that rocked the city, the Roman soldiers. During Passover, hundreds of Roman troops would have been brought in to make sure the Jews were kept under control, and their senses and instincts would have been in overdrive as they watched the numbers multiply in the beginning and felt the emotion climb higher. They would have eventually seen it was fairly harmless, and they likely decided the best strategy was to just leave the people alone. They would have likely been amused by or indifferent to what was going on. There was another group represented in the crowd, may have been the loudest and the largest. In sports terms, they're the bandwagon jumpers, fair weather fans. Oh, they were all for Jesus then, ready to make him king, but only because they believed Jesus was coming to do what they wanted. He had miraculously healed and fed so many people. And here they believed he was going to overthrow the Romans and set up a Jewish empire. They believed Jesus was following their plan, so they followed him. Jesus knew their roots were shallow, their devotion temporary. He wept for them as he saw just a few days into the future when they would be shouting, "Crucify him!" Jesus still weeps today when he looks into our crowd, into our culture. He still sees indifferent Romans. "Oh, go on with your parade, Jesus. Just don't bother me with it." He sees modern day Pharisees, like the whitewashed tombs he described them as, polished on the outside, but no real heart for him. And there are still fair weather followers. It's easy for them to shout his praises when the parade's rolling by and things are going according to their plans. When things turn hard, they turn away. When Jesus looked into the crowd, he also would have seen some of his first and closest followers. He would have seen and heard them laughing and shouting and singing genuine praise to him. I wonder if he wept, at least partly because he knew what they would go through as they faithfully finished their journeys. The chains, the prison cells, the beatings, James beheaded, Thomas stoned, John boiled in oil, Peter crucified upside down. There are still many who see him for who he is and continue to follow him in a world that isn't the way it was in the beginning nor will be one day. Jesus weeps about cancers and wars and unthinkably cruel dictators and car wrecks and viruses and mass shootings. He sees some of the people who love him the most dying some of the ugliest deaths. And Jesus weeps because he sees millions who don't see him for who he is, who don't want to see him. And Easter really comes down to how you see him. It was one of the main reasons Jesus got on that donkey colt in the first place, to ask a question that hangs in the air 2,000 years later. When you see him, when you think of him, what do you see? What do you really see? Who do you really see?
Oh soul, are you weary and troubled? No light in the darkness you see. There's a light for a look at the Savior, and life more abundant and free. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Through death into life everlasting, he passed and we follow him there. O'er us and no more have dominion, for more than conquerors we are. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely